so I would just like to say, again, welcome to everyone to the second in our series of charrettes that fall under this broader theme of using observation networks to advance Earth system understanding, state-of-the-art data model integration, and frontiers. And as Leho so nicely introduced, the charrette is sort of an intense focused meeting where all the stakeholders come together and attempt to resolve complex and map solutions. So we're excited to facilitate this charrette series. So this webinar is going to begin with a suite of lightning talk presentations that touch on spatiotemporal scales, process representation, and motivating science questions by modelers involved in different observatory networks. And then after the presentations, we're going to open it up for open discussion and exchange of ideas. So just a bit of housekeeping, please unmute yourself when we get to the discussion part of the webinar. But then once you have made your point, just remute, as this will help us avoid issues with audio feedback. And if you continue to have trouble with your audio, just use the chat window. Feel free to drop any questions or comments you have, and myself or one of the other discussion leaders will be happy to put that to the group. And just as a plug, so this is the second in our series of charrettes. We're holding these monthly from November through February, and we're working toward this cross-network workshop that we're going to hold at NEON HQ this winter. So there will be another, at least one, if not two, charrettes coming up later in the winter. So we're really excited to have you, and thanks for being here.
All right, thank you both. So I would like to say again, welcome everyone. Our goal today is to think about harmonizing scale and process representation across critical zone-oriented models. And today we're going to have 6 panelists who will be giving lightning presentations, about 3 minutes each. We have Ying, Jack, Nicole, Lily, Ben, and Dave. And then Leho and I will be helping to help facilitate some of this discussion. We can move forward now. So right now what we're going to do is just really quickly introduce everything that's happening, go through the lightning talks, and then facilitate that discussion. Just so that you have an understanding of what we ask the panelists to do is we ask them to identify previously unrealized opportunities for synthesis understanding across modeling perspectives, to identify gaps in understanding that require new approaches and expertise not currently captured in the community or by the community members, and key observations within the CZO LTER ISMIC NEON networks that could support breakthroughs in near-Earth surface modeling. Okay, let's move on. So as we said before, as the lightning talks are going through, if you have a question, go ahead and put that question right into the chat box, and we will, be able to go straight through those as time is going on once we get to the discussion, or just hold the questions to the end. So this is our lineup of the types of talks that we're going to get to. I am not sure if Ying will be able to join us yet, so we might just start with Nicole's and see if she's able to jump on, unless she's here. But we really have a diversity. What we asked for was a diversity of modelers, people who think about theoretical models, process-based models, large scales, small scales, so that we could kind of get an idea of all of the different types of modeling systems that are out there. All right? We can move on. So Leho, I'll let you think about or introduce these discussion questions.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so as you saw, this is a very diverse set of modelers that we asked to serve as panelists, and again, we thank them very much for their willingness to participate in this. And this is just the hope is that this is the start of a much longer conversation about how these networks can be coordinated together to support Earth system modeling in general. And so these are just a list of potential prompts that we might consider for discussion at the end of these lightning talks, but there may be other questions. But the hope is that we're able to sort of look at this from kind of the 50 or even 100,000 foot level and think about how these observational networks can add value to our various modeling problems, and how the data from these are used across these different varieties of models. Additionally, what feedback do we as modelers maybe have to those observational communities, thinking about how those networks are configured and designed, there's often a tension between this idea of monitoring individual sites versus performing large-scale field campaigns in those kind of network communities. And, you know, we as modelers maybe have some perspective on what the sort of appropriate balance between long-term monitoring of a few different variables versus large-scale field campaigns ought to be. But also, I think, you know, it would be great to think about, you know, what are some big picture science questions that we could address by leveraging these networks as networks in their spatial extent, as well as, you know, how do they complement one another. So, you know, this is just a synopsis of a few questions that we hope to get to by the end of these lightning talks. So with that, I'm going to serve as the moderator for the lightning talks. And they're going to go relatively quick because we only have now 45 minutes to get through the lightning talks and the discussion. And so I'm going to automatically advance the slide at the end of 3 minutes for our panelists. So with that, I want to ask if Ying, are you out there? Were you able to resolve your audio connection issue?
She said she was.
Okay, so Ying, if you're on, please go ahead. So I'm not hearing Ying. So should we go directly to Nicole, and then maybe we can come back to Ying after Nicole's lightning talk?
Yeah, let's see if we can resolve that.
Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Shall I start?
Yeah, go ahead, Nicole.
So I'm Nicole Gasparini. I just want to acknowledge that I have many, many awesome people who work on this with me. I have a lot of animation, Leho. I'm just going to say forward. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk about landscape evolution modeling and how the opportunities between data collected in the CZOs and what we can do with that to advance our understanding of evolution. So first off, what is a landscape evolution model? We are primarily interested in how landscapes or topography changes through time. So elevation is the primary variable. And generally, it's some combination of hillside processes, river processes, and glacial processes are controlling the topography through time. Generally, they're thinking over long time scales, so thousands of years to millions of years, and large spatial scales, tens of square kilometers and up. Advance, please. Okay, so what are the links between landscape evolution models and CZOs? So many, but I'm going to focus here on degree of weathering and how it impacts landscape evolution. Forward, please. So what you see down here are two photos from Emma Harrison, and these are from the Luquillo CZO. On the left, you see a very deeply weathered soil profile, and on the right, a very shallow profile. Forward, please. And what you see now is from Gilles Brocard and others' work. These are river profiles, so elevation versus distance, and you can see a break at 600 meters. Above 600 meters, you have very deep soils, and below 600 meters, you have very shallow soils. Forward, please. What you can also see is that these are also images from Gilles. In the top two photos, those are above 600 meters, what the channel looks like, and the bottom are below. And above, you can see there's a lot of sediment. That's what we call an alluvial river. Below, you see bedrock only. And so what we know is that there are links between how soil, the sediment produced on the hill slope, what that does to the processes going on in rivers. And it also influences how sediment and water are delivered to the rivers. So there's a lot of complex and super interesting feedbacks that are going on. Forward, please. This is some modeling. I forgot about, okay, so why are we not doing this? The challenge is really disparate scales here. Forward one more time.
This is some old modeling, 10 years old now, from Ben Crosby and others, focused on the WIPOA, but this was an early attempt to make these links very simplistically. Forward one more time, please. Now, 10 years later, and even 20 years later, we might say, we have much more sophisticated modeling platforms, so we have a chance to get at these disparate scales, but this is really an open book for us to go at. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Nicole. Now I'd like to see Ying. Are you on yet? No, we don't have Ying. So I guess we'll go ahead forward one. And our next speaker is Dave Lawrence at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Dave, are you on?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Awesome. Yes, we can. So start when you're ready, please.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the community land model, which we're evolving into the community terrestrial systems model, where we're unifying land modeling activities across NCAR for weather, climate, ecosystems, and hydrology. And CLM is principally a global model, although it operates on multiple scales, really any scale you want to. It can be run in land-only configurations or coupled to atmospheric models like the community air system model or regional atmospheric model. So we sort of describe this model as an IPCC class type of model. CLM is a process-rich, we call it, process-oriented land model, and it's designed to address a very broad range of terrestrial science questions. Can you go forward? Are you going forward? Yeah, thank you. So our connection to CZOs is coming through this initiative that we have through an NSF Inspire grant, a KWASI NCAR initiative. KWASI is a hydrology organization, university hydrology organization. And in this effort, the goal here was to, CLM is being advanced across many, many different disciplines. And this is an effort to improve hydrology in particular, in Earth system models in general, but in CLM in particular, and accelerate the hydrologic knowledge from hydrologists into this large-scale model. And we decided to start with including what we call representative hill slopes into the model, keeping in mind that most likely at the scales that we tend to work at, large scales, that water redistribution within a grid cell is probably the most important process. And so there's also a big emphasis on evaluation, utilizing stuff like CZO. Next. So what we've done is taken the sort of standard configuration of CLM, which would have one column on a natural vegetated land unit, representing, so all plant photovoltaics would share that column, and there would be no hill slope processes represented, at least explicitly, and say let's put in at least one hill slope in each grid cell and laterally redistribute water across that grid cell. Next. And then we're using the Reynolds Peak CZO, which is a nice test bed because it's a semi-arid region which would have some dependence. ET would probably have some dependence on lateral flow of water, and each one of these bars represents one of these different columns, which is shown on the left, and the uppermost columns would be mostly like sagebrush, and the lowermost column, the riparian zone, you get higher ET in an aspen terrain. And so this is what happens if we do that without lateral flow. What we see is we can't reproduce on the far right the observed aspen ET without lateral flow. Next. Once you include lateral flow, if you look at the yellow and the purple bars there, we can reproduce the aspen ET and also the sagebrush ET on the hill slopes. And so then at the same time, we're not showing this, we're getting runoff correct. Next. And then we're going to couple this model into our new ecosystem demography model called SPACE, which allows us to test the impact of hydrological processes on the controls on biome boundaries. And so the main point here is that we can use the CZO information at this site and other sites to inform the global model and be used in projections eventually. Thank you. Okay, I'm done.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. That was perfect timing. So thank you for that. I'll ask to see if Ying is on yet. Ying, are you on?
No, she had to move on, so
Okay.
she won't be able to join the rest of it.
Okay, sounds good. I will then advance the slides, and the next speaker is Li from Penn State. Li, are you on?
So this is Li as Pam Sullivan. I'm going to present Li's slide for her today. So what Li and her group have been doing, and I've been interacting with them a lot, is developing new modeling capabilities for coupling hydrologic and biogeochemical processes at the watershed scale. Now, currently, existing watershed hydrologic models are primarily used to solve for water quantity issues, and the idea of adding a reactive transport code allows us to start to think about water quality issues. So this new model that they've been building in this lab is to integrate a multi-component reactive transport module that has both reaction thermodynamics and kinetics. And they couple that model with a land surface interaction hydrologic model that's called FLUX-PIM. PIM standing for Penn State Integrated Hydrologic Model. Together makes the RT FLUX-PIM model that they have here. And then most recently, they've been actually using this model at the Shale Hills Critical Zone Observatory to understand concentration discharge behaviors in streams for both chloride and magnesium. Now, what this model has revealed, first off, is that mineral dissolution is playing a much more important role in controlling the chemostatic behavior of solute concentrations in streams as compared to ion exchange, which is something that previously had kind of contrast what we had been thinking. And so if you look in that top right-hand image, what you see is concentration versus discharge, and you see chemostatic would be having very little change in that concentration over very large changes in discharge themselves. So then the other finding with this model and going through this process at Shale Hills is that they've uncovered that differences in the generation of that mass flux, whether it be from inner flow or groundwater, also control whether we see chemostatic behavior or not. Where when you have a larger input of inner flow water, much greater than groundwater, you tend to produce a chemostatic response, where conversely, if groundwater is the more dominant source of solutes, that you begin to see a more dilution effect as you increase in your discharge. Now, what's really interesting is that this model allows us to think about the importance of partitioning water at the watershed scale, but also understanding how it influences stream chemistry and then where those solutes are being derived from. And if you look at those panels that are at the bottom, you can see that the differences between August and December on the left-hand side, being able to visualize differences in water storage spatially, differences in chloride composition as you move towards the center, and then differences in the chloride dissolution rates through time spatially in a catchment. And then this allows us to ask really interesting questions and then go after what are some of the spatial controls potentially of these different processes that are taking place. Now, this model is also now being used at other critical zone and LTERs. So, for example, Lili and I are now working on trying to understand using this model and its influence on stream water chemistry. So we're done. Thanks, Leho.
Great, thanks, Pam. Okay, so next on our list is Ben Poulter from NASA Goddard. Ben, are you out there?
Yes, I'm out there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. So go ahead when you're ready, Ben. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, great. So thanks for inviting me to give the presentation or the one slide. So I wanted to just highlight some of the work that we've done looking at the role of atmospheric CO2 concentrations and feedbacks on the hydrologic cycle. Often hydrologic models ignore these feedbacks by having static vegetation or an oversimplification of leaf level processes like carbon uptake. And what we've shown through the use of a continental scale tree ring network is that plants have responded to increasing atmospheric CO2 concentrations over the past century by reducing stomatal conductance, and this has led to about a 15 to 20% increase in water use efficiency. And that's what's shown in the top panel here based on the tree ring network. And so we can use ecosystem models to try to understand how or what the drivers are, or what the ecosystem scale implications are for changes in water use efficiency. And so the bottom panel is showing what the models are representing in terms of changes in transpiration. And so despite this increase in water use efficiency, some of the models, depending on how they represent phenology, are showing increases in transpiration because of changes in the seasonal length of LAI, or leaf area index. And so we have this fairly complex leaf scale to canopy scale feedbacks in terms of their response to CO2 and climate. For the next part, and so we've been working with physiologically based dynamic vegetation models. This is similar to what Dave Lawrence showed previously with CLM and now FATES. And these models incorporate a representation of physiological responses at the leaf level, all the way through to structural responses in terms of representing size and age structure. We've applied this modeling framework at the landscape scale. So this is showing the hydrologic network for the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and then coupled the ecosystem model with a fairly simple routing model to reproduce hydrographs and stream temperatures for the region. And so using this kind of intermediate complexity approach, we can represent the full kind of suite of leaf to canopy to landscape scale feedbacks that are occurring with elevated CO2 and changing climate. Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ben. Okay, so our final lightning talk speaker is Dr. Jack Brookshire from Montana State University. Jack, are you out there? I know he was having some audio issues earlier. Jack, are you there but muted? Okay, so I don't know if we have Jack on the line. Somebody just unmute themselves.
Yeah, so Leho, I tried this. I just unmuted everyone because I thought maybe Jack has a call-in number that he can't find who he is to unmute himself.
Okay.
So let's try this. There might be some wicked audio feedback, but Jack, go ahead, and then I'm going to remute everyone when you're done.
Is your phone muted, Jack?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good.
Excellent.
So you then? Okay, I'm going to go.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Most of my work is concentrated on the shallow part of the critical zone, the plant soil system and its connection with the atmosphere and hydrosphere. My work really integrates ecology and biogeochemistry, and I'm going to give a couple examples of my modeling approach. So I've spent a considerable amount of time developing and testing simple theoretical models of the nitrogen cycle using long-term data, particularly from LTER sites. And this has really been focused on the watershed level, but I think some of the approaches have implications for global scale processes. Now, the models that I have been working with are simple analytical models, and this represents a trade-off between tractability and complexity. You may not get at all the complexities, but the approach in some cases allows us to cut through Gordian knots and really understand the governing parameter space. And they help us develop and reject hypotheses and discover ideally what the most important parameters of a system are. And I think they offer a unique opportunity to challenge our intuition. So this is the overarching in the left corner there sort of conceptual model of the nitrogen cycle at a watershed level. where each box is a pool in units of nitrogen. So we have organic nitrogen, soil mineral nitrogen, and then plants. And each of these arrows is a input flux or output flux, or a internal cycle in units of mass per area per time. And so each of these can be represented by a simple differential equation or a series of differential equations. So the first example comes from the Coweta long-term research site in North Carolina. And using long-term records of hydrology and stream nitrogen concentrations, we were able to parameterize a simple model of how inorganic nitrogen evolves in watersheds over time, shown on the right of the figure. We were able to show that the seasonal cycle in nitrogen was very well explained by its temperature sensitivity of internal microbial mineralization. Counterintuitively, the model suggested that long-term patterns of nitrogen deposition had very little influence on the dynamics of the nitrogen cycle. And in the end, we were able to derive at quasi-steady state a simple solution that suggested that that nitrogen concentrations in streams were really simply microbial mineralization divided by plant uptake. But we didn't have a mechanistic understanding of what plant uptake was, and so this led us to spend time developing an analytical model of plant uptake under conditions of nitrogen limitation, and using, again, long-term watershed data from a series of LTERs, we're able to parameterize and test this model, which suggests that nitrogen losses to a first order are really driven by diffusion set by nitrogen uptake, and that under a variety of conditions, that percolation or runoff has little effect on nitrogen exports. Now that may seem counterintuitive, but in the end, it shows that if plants are nitrogen limited, that they beat gravity almost under any condition. So then this led us to the idea that we could use our representation of plant uptake, observe nitrogen losses, and then satellite-derived estimates of net primary production to constrain microbial denitrification across the global tropics. And so this was an example of taking site-based, process-based simple models and being able to resolve a very complex phenomenon, that is nitrogen losses via microbial denitrification.
Okay, thank you very much, Jack. So thanks again to all of our speakers, and apologies that we weren't able to get Ying on, and I know that she had a time commitment that she needed to get to, but her slide is in the slide deck, which I believe we can make available to everybody should they be interested. And I would also sort of plug that I've been tangentially involved with some of the work that Ying is doing, and it's some really cool and really impressive stuff. So if you're interested in the Inspire project that she has going on, I would urge you to contact her. So with that, you know, we're moving on to the discussion phase of this charrette, and here's just a list of some potential questions that have been posed. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is, we as a community may decide.
I think you may have lost, I think you have lost Leo.
What's that?
There you go. Oh, you were just lost for a little bit. Go ahead.
Okay. Based on the idea that there are these sort of complementary but distinct networks, the CZO, the LTERs, and the NEON networks, how do we as modelers communicate to those networks and their leadership? You know, what are the essential elements of what they're doing, and you know, how can we influence them to undertake new activities, potentially request and acquire new capabilities that might lead to some you know, big advances in the way that we model Earth surface dynamics, basically. And so So I'm really hoping that based on these lightning talks and based on the expertise that we have out there in this cyber landscape, we can maybe brainstorm some potential discussion topics that that we could sort of, again, continue having a discussion about as we move forward into the future. And on that note, I would like to say, I'll come back to this slide, but before we kind of open it up for discussion writ large, I want to say that Pam has secured a place for us to continue this discussion over beers for those that will be at AGU. So Pam, do you want to talk a little bit more about this?
Just to say that there's the Gordon Biersch, brewery that we can meet at from 5 to 6:30 on Tuesday. Sorry, that doesn't say Tuesday. On Tuesday of AGU, and we'll put that online. So just so everybody's aware.
Great, awesome, thank you. And then Sam, did you want to put in a real quick plug about the charrette number 3? No. Okay. Let's go back to this slide and let's just open it up for discussion. Are there any general or specific comments or questions that that anybody out there would like to address?
Including the panelists.
Including the panelists.
Well, maybe I have a question for the panelists themselves as we're moving forward. Given the idea of looking at the kind of the diversity of the different types of models that were put here, how do you guys foresee, or what are some of the needs or requirements of even seeing how you might interact with other modelers that presented today?
Yeah, this is Ben speaking. This is a good question, and I was thinking about this when Leo was also presenting this first question, and I'd say one of the challenges is that there's so many different modeling approaches that involve despite the issues with parameterization, but also the theoretical issues as we're scaling from microbial or leaf level processes to the stand or to the landscape, and all the modeling teams have different ways of making these scaling assumptions, and so I guess it's something to keep in mind, because if a TZO or monitoring site might make some sort of data collection available, but then it's really kind of up to the individual modeling team to then figure out a way to scale that to something that's meaningful for the model, and so that's one issue. And I guess kind of in my experience, I don't have any directly funded projects with long-term monitoring networks, but we had some interesting kind of dynamics with the Reynolds Creek group on some sagebrush work, and found that found it quite easy to kind of develop the collaboration, because the field folks are really keen to find modeling teams that are interested in bridging the data to the model processes, and so so it seems like some way to try to help facilitate those sort of connections is really valuable.
Yeah, I agree. Can you guys hear me? This is Jack.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with Ben. I think scaling is key, and I think this sort of effort across sites and this network really offers the opportunity to try to uncover generality. It's easy to develop site-specific models that address the idiosyncrasies of particular sites, for certain bedrock lithology or subsurface flow paths, for example. But I think it's important to be searching for what the general patterns are that rise through. And so modeling approaches that, so testing sort of simpler models can sometimes allow for observed emergent patterns that focusing on one site might not provide.
That's a great comment, Jack. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That search for sort of emergent phenomena across the sort of network is a really great way of sort of looking at things. I think one of the, I'll sort of speak up and, because I sort of have lived at various points in my life in both sort of the land modeling world in the way that Dave Lawrence thinks about it, as well as sort of in the landscape evolution modeling world. And it's increasingly striking to me that there hasn't really been yet anybody who's, although it seems like there's been some starts of it, but that there hasn't been a lot of work investigating, how you might use landscape evolution modeling frameworks like LandLab to, produce or improve or develop parameterizations for the hydrology and global land models. And so I would really be interested to hear from Dave and or Nicole about sort of their thoughts on, what that might look like. Is there an opportunity or is there an opening to, use some things that we know about kind of the long-term development of landscapes in order to sort of come up with that, better mousetrap for global land models?
This is Dave. Feedback. I'll answer it a little bit. I mean, we've started to talk about that. I don't know about LandLab in particular, but about trying to, through this INSPIRE project, and you're aware of this paper that Ying is, synthesis paper that she's putting together, discussing different techniques to basically develop large-scale parameterizations for, in this case, our hill slope hydrology, which essentially requires, relatively detailed knowledge of terrain and what's going on underground. And so we have been thinking about that, and we've been soliciting input from lots of different people. And so I think that in our modeling system, we're ready to start thinking about ingesting that kind of information. Up until very recently, we just didn't have the sophistication of model to be able to deal with this at the scales that we work at, but we're moving into that realm. So opportunity is right, I think.
Yeah, cool. Nicole, are you still on? I know she had a commitment.
Sorry, I'm having problems. So I think these are really great questions, and I just want to touch on a couple points. First off, I feel as though the links between long-term landscape evolution model and really the details of how the critical zone is evolving, these are things that landscape evolution modelers have really not been doing. So as much as I love that there is so much data available in the CZOs, I would say our to be talking more with people. As a landscape evolution modeler, we need to be talking more with people about these links that I'm talking about, depths of soil, how long, the timescales over which they evolved, grain size distributions, and that stuff. Before, and it can be informed with data from the CZOs, but we have some very basic things that we need to tackle before we do that. And one of the things is we need to have landscape evolution modelers, sitting with some of the modelers that are on this call and actually making those links, because just doing that step is not an obvious or easy step. Absolutely, we can look at the data and use it to inform the data, but we're not ready to be modeling a particular in the detail that some may be thinking about, and as is available with other types of models.
That's a great comment, Nicole. And so it seems like what I hear you saying is that in some ways there's almost, we could almost think of the critical zone modeling community as being potentially distinct from the critical zone observatory network, and kind of having its own kind of fish to fry separately, and that the use of the data in many ways is sort of to provide a sort of sanity check on some of the modeling that's done. So I think that's a really good comment, and is something that I actually in the observational community I don't think is necessarily appreciated that much. Is that okay? When you say modeler, that could mean any different kinds of things, as we've seen on this talk, and that maybe there needs to be more opportunity to have conversations exactly like this, just to kind of get these folks kind of more familiarized with the different ways that people are looking at and modeling kind of the Earth's near surface environment.
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing really quickly, and I think it brings it back to the idea that even Jack was talking about too, which is I think that there are some pictures that are, emerging in terms of simple pictures that we can begin to even though we might not model one specific watershed or one CZO, things like what is the importance of chemical incision versus physical, incision of channels, right? And so we're able to start to think about timescales, and at least I think in Nicole's world, like we could start to think about some of those factors, even though it might be in a very experimental and kind of even not, not very place-based, but we would begin to understand over what scales that might be sensitive and what scales that might play an important role. And then another one might be something along the lines of, what is the evolution or change in hydrologic properties of soils, where, more and more information is coming about now in terms of some of these properties changing on decadal timescales, which makes an important factor in terms of hydrologic models. And so I think that we might not be at the place where we might be able to do that with a very process-based model in one specific catchment, but I do think that we're at the point where we can start to take some of these ideas that are being generated and start to understand if they're worth how important they are to some of the systems that we're looking at.
I have a comment here sort of related to the previous discussion that Ben was talking about. That, I think what would be a way to advance CZO research would be to set up some model. Obviously, I'm interested in CLM, and we have some plans to do this within Inspire, but I'm not sure if we'll actually get to it. Is that set up CLM, do the sort of the dirty work you have to do at the beginning, so that it would run at all the CZOs, and that with essentially a flip of a couple of switches, you could run all the CZO sites with whatever your default model, and then the model that you perturbed, advanced in whatever way you have, so that you can straightforwardly a student could come in and run all sites without a ton of investment, because it takes quite a bit of time to get these things set up specifically at particular sites. So I think that's the kind of thing that would be nice to do to really advance this kind of utility of the CZO. And then that particular setup can be used to address all different problems. If you're interested in nitrogen cycle, you can focus on the nitrogen cycle across sites. If you're interested in hydrology, you can focus on hydrology. It doesn't have to be each specific project reinvent that wheel.
So Dave, this is Samantha. I think that's a really interesting and exciting idea, and I work at NEON, and I think, similar could be done for NEON sites. But I wonder, do we have issues with fundamental scale mismatches? For example, the pixel size of a CLM grid versus the size. Maybe the CZO sites are big enough, but I wonder some of our NEON sites, what do you think about potential issues with scale mismatches between huge, large-scale models and field-scale observations?
Yeah, so there's always going to be scale issues. CLM is, for the most part, scale agnostic. So you could set up a high-resolution simulation, or you could do what we're doing now, which is with this representative hill slope, put your representative hill slope and at least capture the main fundamental characteristics of that basin, or several basins that would capture at least the fundamental aspects of each particular research basin. There'd be ways to try to get around that. You'd have to make decisions. Or you can at least run, I think most of these CZOs have tower sites associated with them. You you could set up run at that point scale, which CLM can do. And we run, we have about 30 tower sites that we run repeatedly in our model development process. So adding those CZO tower sites would be a first order thing to do. But you could probably do a bit better than that. And to follow up, I think another thing that, and I don't know how much influence everyone here has with NSF, but our experience with development of CLM is that that some of the best advances come when you have a student or postdoc or researcher who spends time in the field and also has modeling experience, and they're doing it all together, right? Maybe as part of a bit of a team, but this concept of I think people are aware of this, but this concept of generating data and hoping that modelers can just make use of it doesn't tend to lead, in a lot of instances, to great insight. But where you have this really circular process, model data synthesis really, but at an individual PI level, doing that's where you find really good. We've found that we've found the greatest opportunity to make advances in the model.
Yeah, I think that's an outstanding point, Dave, and I think sort of speaks to, I think would certainly resonate with NSF from the perspective of sort of the, workforce development. I come from an EPSCoR state, so we're very familiar with that term, but, that increasingly it's important for people to have experience both in the field, but also as modelers. They may sort of have their principal components may be expressed differently in different students, but yeah, I think that's for those of us in the academic community, that's maybe a really good challenge to think about. How do we structure our proposals and our potential projects as individual PIs and as part of these larger initiatives and efforts to facilitate those kinds of team science-based things where everybody's getting a little exposure to both. Field and observational work as well as modeling. That's a really great challenge, and I think that there's certainly pathways and opportunities to create those in ways that NSF would find very attractive in terms of things like broader impacts and kind of educational models.
I just wanted to add one bit about remote sensing opportunities, and I think having been at NASA now for about a year or so, there's just tremendous opportunities with some of the airborne missions that NASA is able to fund and initiate, and so this is everything from using radar data or microwave data to look at soil moisture to hyperspectral data to solar-induced fluorescence, and then also LTER. So, this helps to some extent in terms of these scaling issues that we talked about. But then also come online in the next couple of years are a series of International Space Station missions that are going to provide forest structure and hyperspectral information. And so I think there's a few opportunities that emerge from that. In terms of thinking in advance about what sorts of field data are needed to take advantage of those, or to think about what sorts of model processes don't exist right now that could exist based on the new satellite data that are coming available. So things like how can we better initialize the models with the information that's coming out, but also in terms of helping to calibrate and validate some of the remote sensing observations, which are currently quite poorly funded in these missions, and so there could be some leverage that the CZO LTER networks could gain by saying, okay, we're going to take measurements that can be directly used for the CalVal issues that NASA needs to address.
Ben, could you also speak to really fast to how some of those people would on the call right now would access some of those resources you were just talking about?
Yeah, there's a recent publication in Nature Ecology that I could send around describing some of the new missions that are going to be on the International Space Station in the next couple of years. So I think it talks about like 3 to 5 missions. But then also, just looking through the ROSES call, because that's really, the RFPs through ROSES, the NASA ROSES funding program are quite specific to different instruments, either kind of satellite instruments or airborne instruments.
That's a great comment, Ben. Yeah, so the 2 of the missions that at least I'm aware of that are of immediate potential interest to this audience are the EcoStress instrument, which is a hyperspectral sensor that should be on ISS soon, and JEDI, which is a LIDAR instrument, both for sort of terrestrial ecology. So yeah, that's a really good comment, Ben, and I think it's great, having that NASA perspective, because I think that is something that I think that at least the CZO community, I think the LTER community has been a little bit better at it, and NEON as well, but has really only scratched the surface with how they can sort of potentially be of benefit to NASA in terms of improving Earth observation. So that's a really good comment to capture.
Okay, well, we've reached 11 o'clock, and so it's time for this charrette to end. I really want to say thank you to all the panelists and everyone who participated in this discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and we hope to see you at AGU, and yeah, have a good rest of the week cramming and getting ready to go to New Orleans.
Yeah, the next charrette will be at the beginning of January, sometime in the week of January 8th, just so you're available, so it will be posted online on NEON, and a lot of emails will go out about it too when we know the specific time and date.